What if the most profound key to stabilizing energy in later life is not found on the plate, but in the coherence of a mind? Many assume that energy crashes, brain fog, and irritability are just inevitable parts of aging or complex dietary puzzles, to be fought only with medication or precise food restriction. This common view, however, overlooks the powerful mechanism by which an individual's internal state dictates their physical chemistry. The work of Joe Dispenza provides a lens to understand how the body's energy systems are often direct reflections of familiar mental and emotional patterns. By exploring this connection between the mind and metabolism, a path to reclaiming deep physiological balance emerges, revealing that the body is always listening. The coherence conflict and energy crashes a sudden and overwhelming wave of fatigue, often striking in the mid-afternoon, is a common complaint among older adults. This experience is frequently blamed on the composition of the most recent meal, perhaps too many carbohydrates or too large a portion. While diet is certainly a factor in metabolic health, this perspective often misses a deeper driver of energy instability. From the lens provided by Joe Dispenza's work, these crashes are not just digestive events. They're symptoms of energetic incoherence. They signal a conflict between the body's need for stable energy and the mind's tendency to operate from a state of stress, lack, or survival. When the mind is incoherent, dwelling on past regrets or future worries, it holds the body in a state of high alert. This state of high alert is not merely a mental abstraction. It has profound physiological consequences. The body does not distinguish between a perceived threat, like a stressful memory or anxiety about an upcoming event, and an immediate physical danger. In either case, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, initiating the fight or flight response. This cascade triggers the adrenal glands to release stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones serve one main purpose in this context: to mobilize energy rapidly. They signal the liver to release its stored glucose, glycogen, into the bloodstream, ensuring the muscles and brain have the fuel needed to face the perceived emergency. This hormonal surge creates the high of a blood sugar swing. It is an artificial infusion of energy based on a false alarm. The body is flooded with sugar it does not need for immediate physical action. In response to this sudden hyperglycemia, the pancreas is forced to react strongly. It releases a wave of insulin to shuttle the excess glucose out of the blood and into the cells. In an older adult, particularly one whose cells may already be resistant to insulin, the pancreas may overcompensate, releasing too much insulin. This leads to a rapid and dramatic drop in blood sugar, resulting in the crash of reactive hypoglycemia. The resulting fatigue is profound. The brain, deprived of its primary fuel source, slows down. The muscles feel heavy, and the desire to sleep can become overwhelming. The individual experiences this as a desperate need for a nap, or perhaps another energy boost. This leads to the common pattern of reaching for caffeine or a sugary snack, which only serves to initiate the entire volatile cycle once again. This pattern, repeated day after day, trains the body to exist in a state of metabolic chaos. The body becomes conditioned to these swings, oscillating between the highs of stress-induced glucose release and the lows of the insulin overcorrection. The mechanism is a perfect example of the mind-body connection in action. The incoherent thoughts and stressful emotions generate a chemical reality. This chemical state, defined by stress hormones, directly overrides the body's natural, stable energy management system. The body is simply obeying the signals it receives from the brain. If the brain signals threat, the body provides threat fuel, regardless of what was eaten for lunch. The fatigue is the inevitable physiological consequence of this internal conflict. The body is exhausted not just from the day's activities, but from the invisible war it is fighting against a perceived, yet non-existent, threat. An applied scenario illustrates this clearly. An older individual sits down to a balanced meal of fish, vegetables, and quinoa. While eating, however, their mind is preoccupied. They are replaying a difficult conversation with a family member or worrying about the security of their retirement savings. These thoughts are not neutral. They're emotionally charged. They are in the framework Joe Dispenza describes, broadcasting a signal of survival. Despite the healthy food entering the digestive system, the body's chemistry is already skewed by the cortisol release triggered by these thoughts. The digestive process is compromised, and the metabolic response to the food is primed for instability. 2 hours later, despite the nutritious meal, the individual feels a debilitating crash. They blame the food, the time of day, or simply old age. They fail to connect the crash to the state of internal incoherence they were cultivating while they ate. The body was simply responding to the loudest signal. The stress signal was stronger than the nutritional signal. This demonstrates that stabilizing blood sugar requires more than just dietary management. It requires the management of the internal emotional state. It requires moving the body's baseline operation from survival to coherence. There are, of course, limitations to this perspective. It is crucial to acknowledge that not all energy crashes in older adults are manifestations of energetic incoherence. Conditions such as clinical anemia, hypothyroidism, sleep apnea, or cardiovascular issues can present with profound chronic fatigue. These conditions have structural or organic causes that require specific medical diagnosis and treatment. Attributing all fatigue solely to a lack of mental coherence would be a dangerous oversimplification. A person with severe sleep apnea will experience exhaustion regardless of their meditative practice because their body is being physically deprived of oxygen during the night. Furthermore, the state of insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes involves long-term physiological changes to the cells and the pancreas. While stress management and emotional coherence can profoundly improve the situation, they may not be sufficient on their own to reverse decades of metabolic damage. These conditions often necessitate medical intervention, including medication and strict dietary protocols, to prevent severe complications. The mind-body connection is a powerful lever, but it operates within the context of the body's current physical constraints and medical realities. However, understanding the link between internal states and physical energy remains a significant step towards self-awareness and empowerment. It shifts the focus from passive victimhood, where energy levels are unpredictable, to active participation. Recognizing that a feeling of sudden fatigue could be a signal of internal stress allows for a different response. Instead of reaching for a stimulant, the individual can pause, check their internal state, and consciously work to cultivate a feeling of calm or gratitude. This practice begins to retrain the brain and body, weakening the conditioned response of the stress-glucose-insulin cascade. What am I still allowing that costs me peace? Brain fog as a symptom of survival mode. The complaint of brain fog is pervasive among older adults. It manifests as a frustrating lack of mental clarity, difficulty concentrating, short-term memory lapses, or a feeling that the mind is moving through sludge. This cognitive friction is often accepted as an unavoidable consequence of aging. Yet, these symptoms are also classic signs of unstable blood sugar. The brain is the most energy-intensive organ in the body, consuming a disproportionate amount of glucose. When the delivery of this essential fuel becomes erratic, cognitive function is one of the first systems to falter. Joe Dispenza's perspective would link this physiological instability directly to the brain's operational state. A brain stuck in survival mode is not only chemically stressed, but also energetically starved. The mechanism of this cognitive disruption is twofold, corresponding to the two extremes of the blood sugar swing. During a hyperglycemic event, when blood sugar is too high, the blood itself becomes thick and sludgy. This impairs microcirculation, reducing efficient oxygen and nutrient delivery to sensitive brain tissue. More insidiously, the excess glucose molecules begin to attach to proteins in a process called glycation. This creates advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, which are inflammatory and cause significant oxidative stress. This process essentially caramelizes the delicate structures of the brain, leading to inflammation and cellular damage that directly impairs signaling and processing speed. Conversely, during a hypoglycemic event, or the crash, the brain is quite literally starved of fuel. When blood glucose levels fall too low, the brain does not have enough energy to power its complex networks. Neurotransmitter synthesis, synaptic firing, and the maintenance of cellular electrical gradients all begin to fail. The frontal lobe, the thinking part of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, and focus, is particularly vulnerable. When the frontal lobe is underfueled, the brain functionally shifts its resources to the more primitive areas, the limbic system or the survival brain. This is the part of the brain that Dispenza identifies as the seat of the old self, the center of fear, stress, and reflexive emotion. In this underfueled state, the individual cannot access their higher cognitive functions. They cannot think clearly, creatively, or analytically. They are, by default, operating from their survival instincts. The brain fog is the subjective experience of the frontal lobe going offline. This creates a vicious cycle. The individual experiences brain fog, which generates anxiety about their cognitive health. This anxiety is a survival emotion, which triggers the stress hormone cascade. The stress hormones then signal the liver to release more glucose, perpetuating the very blood sugar instability that caused the brain fog in the first place. Joe Dispenza's work centers on breaking these cycles by moving the brain from incoherence to coherence. A brain in coherence, often achieved through meditation and the cultivation of elevated emotions, exhibits more stable, organized electrical patterns. This state calms the sympathetic nervous system and dampens the survival signals emanating from the limbic system. When the survival signals cease, the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, is no longer hyperactive. This stops the body from flooding itself with unnecessary cortisol and allows for a more stable, natural regulation of blood glucose. A stable fuel supply, in turn, allows the frontal lobe to remain online, restoring mental clarity. An applied scenario highlights this connection between stress and cognition. An older adult is preparing to file their taxes, a task they find stressful and overwhelming. As they sit down with the paperwork, they begin to feel anxious. This emotional state primes their body for survival. Even before they encounter a difficult calculation, their heart rate increases and cortisol begins to rise. As they try to focus, they find they cannot recall simple rules or organize the documents. They reread the same instructions multiple times. This is the brain fog setting in. It is not just age. It is the direct result of the brain shifting its energy away from the frontal lobe in response to the emotional signal of stress. The brain fog itself then becomes a source of deeper stress. The individual thinks, "I am losing my mind," or "I am not capable anymore." These thoughts of fear and inadequacy are powerful survival signals. They lock the brain further into the limbic, emotional reactive state. The stress from the task and the stress about the fog compound each other, guaranteeing that the body's chemistry remains in a state of emergency, making stable blood sugar and clear thinking physiologically impossible. The brain fog becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, triggered and sustained by the mental state of survival. This perspective must be balanced with a clear understanding of its limitations. Brain fog and cognitive decline in older adults are complex symptoms that can signal serious, underlying medical conditions. While blood sugar instability is a major and often overlooked contributor, it is not the only cause. Vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease, untreated vitamin deficiencies, particularly B12, thyroid dysfunction, and even medication side effects can all manifest as severe brain fog. It is critical that persistent cognitive changes be evaluated by a medical professional to rule out these structural or neurodegenerative causes. Furthermore, suggesting that mental coherence alone can reverse advanced cognitive decline would be an inaccurate representation. The brain damage caused by diseases like Alzheimer's is physical and, at present, irreversible. However, The Dispenza framework offers a powerful tool for prevention and optimization. By managing the internal state, an individual can reduce the inflammatory and oxidative stress associated with glucose swings, thereby protecting the brain from one of the major drivers of age-related damage. For a healthy individual, it can mean the difference between a sharp, focused mind and one clouded by metabolic chaos. The crucial insight is that mental clarity is not a passive state. It is an active, physiological one that depends on a stable energy supply. The subtle sign of intermittent brain fog, often dismissed as tiredness, can be the brain's primary way of signaling that its fuel line is compromised. This compromise, in many cases, does not begin with food. It begins with the incoherent, energetic signature of a mind stuck in a loop of familiar stress, worry, and fear. The fog is the symptom of the brain being held hostage by the body's survival chemistry. Where do I trade comfort for approval today? Emotional volatility and the stress hormone cascade a sudden, disproportionate spike of irritability, a wave of anxiety that appears from nowhere, or a moment of unexplained sadness can be deeply unsettling. For older adults, these emotional swings are often blamed on life stressors, loneliness, or simply the grumpiness of age. However, these intense emotional shifts are frequently a direct, physiological symptom of blood sugar dysregulation. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to its fuel supply, and when glucose levels crash, the body interprets the situation as a life-threatening emergency. This physiological alarm is experienced subjectively as intense, negative emotion. This aligns closely with the principles Joe Dispenza explores, where individuals can become addicted to the chemistry of their familiar, negative emotions, which are often the very hormones that disrupt metabolic balance. The mechanism at play is the body's non-negotiable survival hierarchy. Consistent brain function is paramount. When blood glucose drops below a safe threshold, a state of hypoglycemia, the brain perceives an immediate threat to its survival. It does not matter if the individual is safe in their living room. Chemically, the body is in crisis. This triggers an emergency response, a powerful activation of the sympathetic nervous system. The primary goal is to raise blood sugar fast. The adrenal glands are commanded to release a flood of counter-regulatory hormones, primarily adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol. This chemical cocktail is the chemistry of survival. Adrenaline is the fight-or-flight hormone. It sharpens the senses, increases heart rate, and makes the individual feel agitated, shaky, and on edge. Cortisol, the longer-acting stress hormone, further signals the liver to produce new glucose. The crucial point is this. This surge of adrenaline and cortisol is chemically identical to the surge experienced during a moment of intense fear, panic, or anger. The individual, sitting quietly, is suddenly awash in the hormones of terror and rage. Their brain then scrambles to find a reason for this feeling, latching onto the nearest mild annoyance, a slow-running computer, a comment from a spouse, and amplifying it into a major source of irritation. This is the origin of hanger, the potent combination of hunger and anger. It is not a psychological failing. It is a physiological event. The irritability is a symptom of the adrenaline surge. The anxiety is the body's panic response to a fuel crisis. This creates a powerful and destructive feedback loop, especially when viewed through the Dispenza model of conditioning. An individual who lives in a baseline state of stress, worry, resentment already has elevated cortisol. This makes them more prone to insulin resistance, which in turn leads to more volatile blood sugar swings. The blood sugar crash then triggers the release of more stress hormones, validating and reinforcing the very emotional state that contributed to the problem. The person becomes trapped in a cycle. The body, accustomed to high levels of cortisol, begins to crave it, much like an addiction. The individual subconsciously seeks out the thoughts, worries, and conflicts that will generate their familiar hit of stress chemistry. This emotional state drives the metabolic dysregulation, and the resulting metabolic dysregulation, the crash, drives the release of the same stress chemicals, making the negative emotion feel justified and overwhelming. The individual is not having a feeling. They are being the feeling, living in a body chemically conditioned to it. An applied scenario illustrates this trap. An older woman is waiting for her adult son to call at an appointed time. He is 10 minutes late. Under normal physiological conditions, she might feel mild annoyance. Today, however, her blood sugar is dropping from an earlier spike. As the glucose level falls, her body initiates the emergency adrenaline response. Suddenly, the mild annoyance transforms into intense anxiety and anger. Her heart pounds, and her thoughts spiral. She doesn't care. Something terrible must have happened. I'm always being disrespected. The emotion she is feeling is the adrenaline. The story she's telling herself is the brain's attempt to make sense of that powerful chemical signal. When her son finally calls, apologizing for a minor delay, she reacts with a level of anger that is shocking to them both. She is not reacting to the 10-minute delay. She is reacting from a body that was chemically convinced it was in mortal danger. This emotional volatility damages relationships and reinforces her own identity as someone who is anxious or irritable. She has become, as Joe Dispenza describes, unmemorized from a state of peace and thoroughly memorized in a state of survival, a state now reinforced by her own metabolic chaos. It is essential to apply a counterexample here. This framework does not and should not replace a clinical understanding of mental health. Generalized anxiety disorder, clinical depression, bipolar disorder, and PTSD are serious psychiatric conditions with complex origins. While unstable blood sugar can absolutely exacerbate the symptoms of these conditions, making anxiety attacks more frequent or depressive episodes deeper, it is rarely their sole cause. Telling someone in the midst of a major depressive episode that they are simply addicted to stress hormones is both reductive and harmful. These conditions require professional psychiatric and therapeutic care. However, for a large number of older adults experiencing what seems like a personality change, increased irritability, anxiety, or emotional fragility, this metabolic link is a crucial and often missed piece of the puzzle. It separates the person from the symptom. The individual is not angry. They're experiencing a physiological event that feels like anger. This separation is profoundly empowering. It provides a path for intervention that bypasses the need to solve the external problem, like the late phone call, and instead focuses on stabilizing the internal one. This chemical cycle reveals how deeply the body is listening to the mind's definition of safety. The body is constantly adapting to the chemical signals generated by thoughts and feelings. By recognizing emotional volatility as a potential sign of a glucose crash, the individual gains a powerful tool. They can learn to pause when the emotion spikes and ask, is this feeling real or am I in a chemical low? This reflective pause breaks the unconscious reactive cycle. It opens a space where the individual can consciously choose to change their state, perhaps through breath work or a moment of gratitude, rather than being swept away by a chemically induced storm. Which familiar negative emotion might my body be signaling?